Welcome, everyone, to the Prime and Load podcast. This is our second episode, and today we're going to kind of put together a beginner's guide to 18th century warfare. And as always, I'm joined with Dr. Andrew Bramford and Dr. Alex Burns. My name is Lee Gugino. I'm going to be posing some questions to our two doctors so that we can get a lay of the land, since our podcast is all about specifically the 18th century. Seems like a good enough place to start, trying to get the context of where we are. And so I think one of the first things we should talk about is what period we're actually talking about. I know there's kind of this term of the long 18th century, which encapsulates, I think, most of the time period we're talking about. But I don't know, Alex, if you want to start us off today, what periods are we looking at? What wars are we going to be talking about?
Yeah, I mean this is the really cool thing about historians is we're really horrible at selecting date ranges. I mean, you see like the long 18th century and like you see like the long 19th century, the short 19th century. For some people, the 19th century lasts from or the 18th century even lasts from like 1715 to 1789. So it's like 80 years, or maybe the long 18th century. Are we going all the way back from like the 30 Years' War to the end of the Napoleonic Wars, something ridiculous like this. But I think the heart of our interests in this period run for 40 some years between the War of Austrian Succession and the American War of Independence, so roughly from the 1740s through the middle of the 1780s. But with that said, we're going to try and go back earlier, maybe even into the 17th century, to look at the background of some of these larger wars in what Andrew coined to me in a phone call once the high 18th century, the sort of middle years of the 18th century. And I often do kind of think of this as like it's certainly in some ways it's the climax of the 18th century, and these 40 years that we're most interested in. Hey, Andrew, what about you? Where do your interests? I mean, you go a little later into the Napoleonic Wars, but maybe tell us how you see the period.
Yeah, I mean, I think the nice part about this is I can sort of cut out the later interest. Even when I was running from Reason to Revolution, we were looking at everything from the 1720s and 30s right through to Napoleonic. But I'm really quite looking forward to making that cut in this occasion. 1789 and what happens afterwards is fascinating, and it's something I'll still work on. But just to concentrate on the early bit. I mean, my particular interests are more in the 1740s and 50s. As I said in the introductory episode, I'm sort of looking forward to learning more about the American Revolutionary conflict and how you guys see that, because it's not my particular area of expertise. But I think there's definitely a lot to be said from my part from the earlier period. I'd like to get back in earlier still. There's not a great deal being done, it seems to me, at the moment on what I, in my Anglo-centric view, would think of as Marlborough's wars, but of course the wider wars of Louis XIV and all the various people he managed to annoy and fight at different points in his long and distinguished career. So I think if we can round up some qualified guest experts, I'm all for going back into the really high Baroque era of things as well.
And we talked a little about last episode in our welcome episode. This is kind of a less covered time period, especially I know, Andrew, you were talking about that you had students who you believed may not have even touched some of these wars or topics.
It may have changed just to some extent, but certainly, people coming into undergraduate education who never really studied the 18th century at all, and certainly opening it up as an era is to my mind something that we hopefully be achieving with this. I mean, I'd hate to give the impression that I think British students are coming into history courses badly prepared. They're not, but I mean, certainly based on my time at school, history can be quite quite episodic the way it's taught in Britain. You might do the Tudors at primary school, or you might do the Victorians, or whatever it might be. I think I probably studied the rise of the Nazis 3 different times as I progressed through the educational system, which was fine and all, but it might have been nice if we'd done the 7 Years' War once in there somewhere instead.
It sounds like the History Channel, yeah.
Yeah. Alex, we've talked about sort of similar, like American students maybe not skip it, but
it's hard to skip George Washington.
It's hard. It's very hard to skip George Washington over here. Yeah. But it seems like the history interest kind of progresses as the generation progresses. I think we've talked about it when I came and visited you at WVU the one time.
Yeah, they were. So when I started teaching, students were really interested in the American Civil War and World War II. And I think to some extent they still are. But increasingly, I find my students have kind of drifted past the Civil War and are mostly interested in like World War II and Korea and Vietnam. And so, but say you go to a big national conference in the United States, an academic conference like the Society of Military History, and you kind of look through the program and see who's studying what, what various talks are being given. And if you do that, it's mostly World War II at the site, and World War II is a pretty important topic. I'm not out here trying to trash World War II, obviously, but if most of it's World War II and there's like a handful of papers beyond that, we're missing out, and we're even in terms of like policy analysis. I mean, one of the things that frequently you see in the war in Ukraine today is comparisons between what's happening now and say is this a Munich moment? Like perhaps is President Trump appeasing President Putin? Analogies like this, and I don't know that those analogies aren't helpful, but I think it also would be great if we had a larger historical grab bag to kind of grab analogies from. And so that's one of the things that you'd love to see more attention paid to earlier periods before 1800. I mean, not everything is 1800 to the present, and certainly not everything is 1900 to the present.
Sure. So basically, we're doing the world of service.
That's right.
And focusing on this time period, obviously.
A huge service.
Huge service.
Yes.
One may not be able to calculate it, but that's for others to do, not us. So you again, Alex, you mentioned last time you run a blog as well, Cabinets Creek, and I know that that's a specific historical term for. Maybe I have this. It's specifically for a certain time period or a certain context?
Yeah, sure. So it's a term in German, right? I mean, it's Kabinettskriege, and basically this means like the cabinet wars, and it's not like furniture's fighting. But what is happening is, much like today in America, we have a president's cabinet. In the 18th century, all of these kings, they have, cabinets of ministers. And so these ministers, the idea goes in German, are really the ones who are kind of managing this warfare. Some people would translate this like ministerial warfare or maybe imperial warfare. And they would say there's a distinct historical period in warfare from 1648 to 1789. So from the end of the 30 Years' War to beginning of the more nationalistic wars of the French Revolution. And it's an idea that's received a lot of pushback, but broadly, things like the involvement of diplomacy, the goals of these combatants, in a modern military context we call the rules of engagement, all of this combines to form a period between the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648 and the beginning of the French Revolution in 1689.
I would be curious to know, in that time frame, do you guys have specific figures that you think are important? I mean, obviously there's a gazillion we could point to, but maybe some big movers and shakers that you think people may have heard of, even if they're not super familiar with this time period.
Yeah, I don't know if people will have heard of it, but I mean, the one person I always pull out as the 18th century personified almost is Maurice de Saxe, who's a favourite of mine. He's the legitimate son of the Elector of Saxony, who eventually becomes Marshal General of France and spends a fair chunk of the War of the Austrian Succession kicking the British and their allies around the Low Countries and winning arguably Royal France's last impressive series of certainly of European victories. But I mean, his career before that, he's adventurer, soldier of fortune around various parts of Eastern Europe. He tries to bag himself a duchy at one point. He may or may not have been the lover of the Empress of Russia. He ends up in French service. He comes up with a sort of fever dream book of military theories that still gets talked about a lot, and then sort of caps off his career by winning these fairly impressive string of battles at Fontenoy, which is perhaps the one everybody's heard of, and then Rocou and Lafelt as well. Go Maurice, he's my top guy for the period.
And not a man who's afraid to have a good time either.
Oh, absolutely. No, I would say classic 18th century in every respect, living life to the full and then some.
Yeah. And sometimes in paintings you'll see him at some of these battles like in a carriage. Is that accurate? Is he? I mean, he's actually sort of generaling from basically like a horse-drawn carriage, or maybe is this overdrawn?
So Fontenoy, he was commanding from a carriage. He was too ill with dropsy to ride. So yeah.
See, in my mind, when he's in a carriage, I'm thinking he's got like radios and aides coming in. Like, no, this is just an invalid carriage.
Pretty much. Yeah.
You know, when you party enough, you've got to have a carriage.
I'm
not suggesting he chose the Fontenoy battlefield. I mean, it's a perfect killing ground that he created that Cumberland walked straight into. But maybe the fact that it wasn't a huge sprawling battlefield that he could control reasonably well without needing to move too far was part of the appeal.
You know, there can be multiple reasons for one decision. You know. And what about you, Alex? If you think there's somebody that people would recognize.
Well, I mean, we've already kind of said Washington, right?
He's the easy answer for sure.
And I think that, certainly a Sunday school answer for the American audience. But beyond that, I mean, people like Frederick the Great, people like the Duke of Cumberland, who Andrew mentioned. I mean, just looking at Frederick's career, he is a royal warlord in a time that's really uncommon. I mean, often Americans sort of think of medieval and early modern history in a slightly truncated way, you know, kings on horseback, you know, with swords, out leading their armies. That's pretty uncommon in the 18th century. I mean, you have royal figures who are military adjacent, people like George II, who sort of does actually come out with sort of sword in hand and you know, sort of try to make a good show at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. But Frederick is like there on campaign with the army, actually performing the role of a commanding general for most of his life. He fights 3 major wars, one where he attacks poor militaries of Austria in the First Silesian War, the War of Austrian Succession. Then he starts off, at least in Europe, a big world war in the 7 Years' War, in which he's fighting against almost, I mean, like Napoleon-esque, sort of fighting against this huge coalition of enemies that are trying to overrun his country, sort of bouncing back and forth between the various fronts where he has to fight. He's a fascinating man. He's a poet, if you believe Franz Sabo up in Canada. He's a bad poet. He's a sort of a composer. He plays the flute. And again, if you believe Franz Sabo, he's a bad flute player. But you know, Andrew sort of said, you know, Maurice de Saxe is a Renaissance man. He's man of the Enlightenment, and to some extent, Frederick is as well. Frederick is someone who, in some ways, often the American standpoint and view of monarchs is they kind of use the country as like their own personal piggy bank, and they have a lot of mistresses, and they spend state funds building palaces for themselves. And Frederick is kind of the antithesis of this in some ways. I mean, he has nice palaces, don't get me wrong, but he really does work tirelessly on trying to be a good state leader or be an effective state leader. Maybe morally good is a bit more ambiguous. I don't know that I think he's a great guy. Christopher Duffy, one of my scholarly mentors, says he's definitely the principal author of the bloodletting in the mid 18th century. So he starts a lot of wars. But I guess I would say, looking at figures like this, the 18th century is a time where, there's some stuff might seem odd. I've had students say, man, this warfare seems almost like classy. What's going on? I mean, you have kings who are playing the flute and writing poetry, leading armies in battle. And it is a kind of, from our modern or postmodern perspective, it can seem odd or ridiculous. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't deadly serious for figures like Frederick, and that the men at the time were pursuing the military art to the fullest of their abilities.
We've been talking about the 18th century, but I think eventually we have to ask the question: why does this matter to us now? What could we gain from this period?
I think there are certain factors of warfare that remain constant. I mean, I have trouble. A lot of my academic Napoleonic work was social history of the army in that era, and I certainly clashed with scholars who felt that soldiers have been soldiers throughout history, and I think that's true to a point. You know, the society that produced Wellington's army or Frederick's army that Alex has studied, is very different to the society that produced modern servicemen and women. On that extent, we have to be careful. But I think in terms of command and so forth, and I think that the conduct of campaigns and generalship, and certainly the diplomacy that comes with war, there's certainly an awful lot that's still relevant.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at why they're fighting and what they're trying to do, the legacies of these wars. I mean, you don't have British-controlled India, which is such an important part of the 19th and 20th centuries, and there are important legacies down to the present day in terms of sort of the cultural legacies of British India without the 18th century wars. You don't have the development and creation of the United States without these 18th century wars. And I don't think any of us would say, man, world without America, that would be a changed world. Not much difference if there's no United States, right? I mean, it's one of the global superpowers today. The rise of Russia as a military power occurs in the late 17th century and 18th century, from the time of, say, Peter the Great to his daughter Elizabeth Petrovna. I mean, Russia really emerges as one of the European great powers in that age. I've already mentioned the rise of Germany. The British create a global empire and lose a global empire and then create a second one, kind of in the course of the 18th century, right? And so it's a time where, I think there are operational and maybe even tactical through lines that we could draw. I agree with Andrew's point that maybe socially, in kind of the mental world of these soldiers, they're probably, I mean, if you take a GI from Buffalo in 2025 and compare him to a redcoat from Britain in 1755, they're probably a little different. They have probably some different outlooks on religion, and maybe there are some through lines. I mean, maybe we shouldn't get into those through lines too much, but I guess I would say, by and large, in the terms of the legacies of these wars, it's hugely relevant to our world today. In terms of the lessons, and that sometimes that can make historians a little worried. Can we really draw lessons from the past? The past isn't a perfect guide, and if you're only thinking about history, you try to manage current politics and sort of statecraft. You've got one part of it, maybe not the entirety of it, but these 18th century wars do absolutely have relevance the world of George Washington, the world of Frederick the Great. In some ways, this is the world that's creating modern warfare. They're building an engine that people like Napoleon and Eisenhower will eventually, sort of fine tune into the modern world of warfare that we have today.
So when we talk about maybe the goals and strategies of armies or commanders at this period, is there any difference between their goals and objectives in the 18th century than there are now? Are there major differences?
I think certainly the idea of total war, anything like that, is by and large anathema. You're fighting an enemy state. You're not necessarily attempting to destroy that state. I mean, it becomes a little bit more confused with the various rebellions and revolutions. Thinking of the Jacobites, but I mean also your War of Independence obviously has a nastier streak to it at times in some of the theatres than perhaps would be the norm. But I mean, leaving aside attempts at regime change, which was the Jacobites in the 45, or attempts to break away as a nation. I mean, you're essentially looking at wars for control of territory. I certainly don't mean to suggest that it was in any way pleasant or restrained on the battlefield, but perhaps in terms of the goals and the level of animosity, by and large, perhaps that your average combatants might have felt against one another. And again, British redcoats pacifying the Highlands after Culloden, probably a bad example of that. Or as I say, maybe some of the partisan war in the Southern Theatre in the Independence War, where it really does become bitter and personal.
From what it sounds like to me, it's whereas a morality might be a larger player in modern warfare than it is in the 18th century. Is that too simplistic?
I guess I would say the rules of engagement are certainly a little different, and the rules of engagement are strict in some ways in the 18th century, and then in some contexts they're not. Wayne Lee at UNC Chapel Hill has a really good book on this called Barbarians and Brothers, where he kind of looks at the way when European armies fight each other, usually the rules of engagement are fairly strict, but if they're fighting against rebels, if they're fighting against indigenous peoples around the world, the rules of engagement look a little bit different than they might in Europe. So in terms of morality, I'm not sure that necessarily 18th century state leaders, when thinking about should I engage in warfare, were any more or less moral than people might be in the 21st century. I mean, if we look at the various conflicts going on around the world today, but in terms of what sort of motivates these generals, how these generals think, I mean, how do you control cities? How do you hunt down an insurgency? I mean, these are questions that are as present in 2025 as they were in 1775. As this is, I mean, we're not there yet, but this is the anniversary of the year in which an insurgency basically coops up part of the British Army in Boston, right? And for much of the American War of Independence, Washington is working through mental problems that soldiers still work through today. How do we control territory? How the enemy's holding an urban space? How do we get them out of that urban space? These are, it looks a little different in the 18th century, but I would say I do see some through lines in terms of the goals. I mean, literally, the 18th century is the first time that Ukraine was conquered and occupied by Russia, and now we're seeing that occurring again in our lifetime. And so, yeah, I think the goals are fairly similar in terms of how Washington goes about trying to evict the British Army from urban spaces. That might be a little different, but there's a number of similarities.
And do you think a lot of those differences are in thought process of the time period, or purely technological, tactical level decisions?
Yeah, I mean it is a different world, and the example I usually give with my students is the Battle of Germantown, in 1777, where, and the Patriot kind of gets this wrong, but in the course of the fighting, a lot of 18th century generals have dogs, right? Like General Charles Lee in our Revolution has a whole pack of dogs that follow him around. Well, General Howe's dog, the British general's dog, retreats with the American army by mistake. The dog gets confused, like, well, I'm going to follow these guys off the battlefield, and so they get back to the camp, and I don't know, like, they look at the tag or whatever it is, but they like, oh, this is General Howe's dog. Oh man, we've got the enemy general's dog, and the common soldiers respond in a way that I think sounds more like modern people might, like people who are really frustrated, who just fought a battle in which a lot of their friends died. They go, well, now we get the enemy general's dog. Should we try him as a spy? Should we hold him as a hostage? What should we do? And George Washington's response is basically like, no, idiots, give me the dog. We're going to send him back to General Howe with a note. And so it is an age of kind of gentlemanly warfare in this respect. But at least between elites, between different generals. I mean, you don't want to mess up the enemy general's dog. That would be beyond the pale. But by the same token, will we invade Iroquois and burn all the crops that the Iroquois League needs to eat for the winter in 1779? Yeah, we're also going to do that. So it is a different mental world that maybe than ours in some way. But again, it's kind of a mental world in terms of restraint that you switch on and switch off.
We've been talking about armies and generals, and I think armies being kind of the tool of fighting these wars. How are these things structured? What do they look like? I know modern militaries, they've got an incredibly rigid structure with 1,000 different pieces. But what does that look like in our context, in our time period?
Kind of pulling back and maybe looking at a sort of broader, like, beginner perspective, these armies are divided essentially into three branches of service, we might say, right? So you have your infantry, which is they're the vast majority of the army. In some cases, something like 75% or more. The actual number of soldiers are infantrymen with flintlock muskets, wearing regimental coats and cocked hats. A smaller number of men, maybe 20% of the total number of men in the army might be cavalry soldiers or men fighting on horseback in a variety of different units. I mean, there's a bewildering number of types of soldiers in these 18th century armies. You've got fusiliers and grenadiers and musketeers and, varieties of light troops, and maybe we can get into all that a little later. But cavalry, you basically have light and heavy cavalry. Light cavalry can be used in sort of an operational setting in addition to on the battlefield. They're kind of like the eyes and ears of the army, whereas the infantry soldiers are the troops that do most of the fighting. They're you need infantry soldiers in order to take ground on the battlefield. Light cavalry are used to kind of scout the way for the army. Heavy cavalry, again, maybe a slightly more limited use. We often think of early modern warfare as being, maybe with the Middle Ages, sort of a time when cavalry are dominant, large men on large horses wearing breastplates and, riding over their enemies in the Napoleonic Wars, things like this. Really, cavalry is useful especially if you are fighting your opposite number. You engage fighting directly against other cavalrymen. If the enemy is disrupted, if the linear formations that these men fight in are not kept in order, cavalry can break through, and that's a real danger. But cavalry, to use a video game terminology, which I don't know is super helpful, cavalry is in some ways like a glass cannon. It's something that can be extremely devastating if used effectively, but it also in some ways is quite vulnerable. It's a resource that it's very easy to use incorrectly on the battlefield. And then last but not least, we have, a lot of infantry and cavalrymen in the 18th century would say it is least, because they're noblemen, and the artillerymen are, men who do math and are probably from the bourgeois, the middle class. They're not, they're not really great noblemen like the infantry and cavalry officers. But the artillerymen in some ways are the arm that's like on the way up in the 18th century. I don't want to overdraw modern parallels, but artillery might almost be something like drones today. I mean, it's something that is newer in a full mobile battlefield role. Certainly used a lot in the 17th century, but in terms of the specialist, anti-personnel munitions that are being fired, the types of artillery, the Russian army particularly sort of embraces artillery in a battlefield role, kind of devastate the Swedes in the Great Northern War. Christopher Duffy, who I mentioned before, argues that artillery, especially particularly canister or anti-personnel munitions, which kind of turns the cannon into a giant shotgun, that causes more casualties than any other type of weapon in the 18th century. And that's a hard thing to prove, because when a man's been shot and the doctors are operating on him, it's like, what is this, a musket ball or a canister ball? What exactly is the difference here?
Doesn't make a lot of difference at that point.
To the guy who's been shot, he's like, no, not much difference at all. But certainly artillery is growing and expanding in a battlefield role in the 18th century. It's almost like a new branch of service, so a lot of men who are outside the traditional structures of power are kind of finding their way into them as a result of serving in the artillery. But these three branches, what an 18th century Englishman would have called foot, horse, and guns, they are together making up 18th century armies and kind of giving structure on the battlefield to these forces.
We've been talking about them a little bit. The men that make up these armies, we've got structures of those men as well. Can we kind of go into who are the officers, who are the NCOs, who are the private soldiers, and what kind of people are making up these armies? I know there's a famous Napoleonic quote about who makes up the British Army.
You want to tell us about the British, Andrew?
I take it we're talking about the Wellington's "scum of the earth" comment, which even
often quoted
and frequently misused. Yeah, people tend to leave off the bit where it says, "But what fine fellows we've made of them."
We don't like that part. We just skip back to the first part.
No bias here. No, I think Wellington, as ever, is being pithy and not especially nice. Two characteristics that I generally associate with Wellington. Great general, but you wouldn't want to have a pint with him. There's a little bit of a sense, and I guess this varies from army to army, that there are the bad apples and ne'er-do-wells, the people who have failed in civilian life and probably haven't got very many options left. But any regiment worth its salt is going to try and get rid of people like that if they can. One of the evils of the British manpower system in the 18th century was that if a regiment was going off overseas, it would get its numbers brought up to strength by what they call drafting, so sending men from another regiment. And you can bet your life that any colonel being told he's got to draft off 100 men is going to try and get rid of the awkward suspects. A lot more of it, though, really. And again, I'm speaking of the British Army, but I think this is valid to a point. It's not so much people who are borderline criminal in the way that the Wellington quote suggests. It's people whose lives have gone a bit wrong in other ways. I mean, the most common one is simply employment patterns changing. Either you've got agricultural labourers who are out of work. I think it's originally a French saying that a bad winter is the best recruiting sergeant. That if the crops have failed and food's short, and you're maybe son of a big family, are you are you going to starve, or are you going to put King Louis's coat on?
I would say, even in the United States, you have this kind of legend, and it's very true in the first few years of the war, of like the citizen soldier volunteer, sort of the Minuteman who picks up probably his fowling piece and goes to fight against the British, and I'd say in 1775, 1776, maybe even early 1777, that's pretty accurate. But as the American War of Independence goes on, the American army starts to look a little bit more like other European armies. Less patriotic volunteers, more men who are there because they need a job, men who are there because maybe they're a paid substitute of someone else who doesn't necessarily want to be in the Continental Army. And that trend continues throughout the war. And indeed, some states, I think New Jersey is maybe the most prominent example of this, are involved almost in like an early process of conscription, or trying to draft men into the army from the militias. Now, that's a very common story all throughout the 18th century in Europe as well. Obviously, probably the most famous examples of conscription in the 18th and 19th century are from Russia, where you're conscripted into the army for 25 years or life, and the other serfs in the village with you hold like a mock funeral for you because they know they're never going to see you again when you go off to join the army. In places like Prussia, it's almost a little bit more like modern reservists. You're conscripted into the army, and you do maybe 2 years of basic training, but after that time, for 10 months out of the year, you're furloughed home to your village, so you're still kind of like in the economy working. You're not in the army full time, and then obviously in wartime, you're kind of called up, to serve. Most 18th century armies, in addition to these conscript, which is, I talked about Russia, Prussia, it's also true in Sweden. By the end of the 18th century, Austria starts this process of conscription as well. There are also volunteers. These volunteers are essentially the most common form of recruit across most 18th century armies in Britain, in France, in the German states, in Russia. There's even voluntary recruitment there, often untold alongside the stories of conscription. Peter the Great actually has to say, no, we don't need so many serfs to be volunteering for the army in the Great Northern War. We'll have conscripts, but we don't want all the serfs to be leaving their estates. Please don't all come volunteer for the army at once. So there is absolutely a volunteer tradition, both in the United States and in Europe. These men come from, as Andrew said, often rural backgrounds. I mean, that shouldn't surprise us. 80% plus of the population in the 18th century world lives in a rural environment. And so it's a relatively small number of men, maybe 15% or so, that live in an urban environment in the 18th century. So most of the recruits are rural. Most of them are coming from fields like they're day laborers, they're agricultural workers. In the War of Independence, depending on who you believe, but scholars like Glenn Stepler would argue that 30% of the British Army in the War of Independence are out-of-work textile workers. So there's an economic depression, cloth making a very common trade in 18th century Britain. These men, out of work, join the army instead. So when there's when you don't have maybe a lot of other options, or you feel very strongly about maybe the danger that is presented to your country, you would join the army out of patriotic motivations. Maybe you need to feed your family. Maybe you're drafted into the army. All of these, are ways that soldiers find themselves wearing, as Andrew said repeatedly, the king's coat, whether it's King Louis or King Frederick or King George. Andrew, would you talk to us a little bit? We talked about common soldiers, and that's sort of my wheelhouse. Would you talk to us a little bit about kind of maybe aristocratic traditions or buying a commission? How do you become an 18th century officer in the British Army?
Yeah, I can. There's just something I was going to jump back on there when you were saying about patriotism, and I think that's entirely valid, and probably something that we don't always take into account, that we think of as a more modern thing. But another feature of the 18th century that's probably worth mentioning, the amount of soldiers who actually serve an army that isn't theirs. I mean, thinking particularly of the French army in this era consists of a number of Swiss, Irish, German. There's a Swedish regiment in there somewhere. The Dutch have a Scots brigade. The Spanish have an Irish brigade, the same as the French do. And sometimes it's sort of almost your classic mercenary service that you're seeking a soldier's trade for the reasons we've talked about. And Switzerland in this era doesn't have a military tradition as Switzerland, but there are Swiss regiments in service in a number of powers, and if you're a young Swiss man in the sort of circumstances that we've outlined, you go off and join, as it might be, the French or the Piedmontese army in one of their Swiss regiments. So I think that's something to factor in. That yes, on the one hand, patriotism is probably more of a motivator than some more traditional accounts would allow for, but at the other end of the scale, you've got people either for mercenary reasons or in the case of some of the Irish regiments, they can't serve in the British Army because they're Catholics, so they go and take a career with a foreign army instead. So that's something certainly I'd hope to come back to as we progress through this. But yeah, officers was the actual question, wasn't it? Sorry, I was thinking of that as you were speaking. I thought, no, I'm going to have to jump in and say that piece, but. I think again, I can probably speak most to the British Army, and Alex, you can maybe jump in and tell me if and how it's different in in say the Prussian case or the Americans. I think there's an idea of very aristocratic officers in this era, that they're all sprigs of the landed gentry, and if we extend that with certain stereotypes, that it's the it's all breeding and no brains, and yeah, people like that exist, for sure, and certainly in the French army, it's pretty difficult to get on if you've not got a pretty impressive noble pedigree. You're certainly not going to, if you get in at all as an officer, you're certainly not going to rise if you're from the new nobility or the bourgeois classes. If you're the comp to this or the other, then you're going to have a far easier military career than otherwise. The British, I think there's a little bit. British Army is a little bit more middle class than perhaps the stereotype allows. Purchase does exist, but so just to be clear, if we could do this as a beginner's guide, purchase is literally you buy your rank, you buy an ensign's commission in the infantry or a cornet's commission in the cavalry, and you can in due course progress by buying the next rank up as vacancies. As vacancies become available, and there are variants of that in the continental armies. Up into, I should say, the European armies. I don't confuse with the continental army, which obviously is a different thing entirely. Continent of Europe, I'm speaking of. Up to the point that you effectively buy a regiment as colonel, as chef, or as inhaber, or however it might be styled, and you own that regiment, and the company captains are in fact subcontractors to the colonel, and they own their companies, and the state effectively abdicates the financial responsibility for the regiment to the officers, and it's very transactional. And there's an idea as well that if you certainly in the British way of looking at it, that if you bought a commission, you have a stake in the status quo. You wouldn't get a pension, but at the end of your career, you could sell your commission and retire on the proceeds. Now, obviously, if you were so inclined to join a rebellion against your monarch, then clearly your commission would be forfeit, and so you're not only putting your life on the line, but you're putting your livelihood on the line as well. And in the context of fairly recent British history, thinking of the Glorious Revolution and the army changing sides and abandoning poor old James II when something better comes along, it's not an entirely unreasonable fear, and the idea of having somebody with a financial stake makes sense. But at the same time, you do get a lot of people who, maybe they can afford the first commission, maybe they've got the first commission through patronage, through an appointment. It's very much the classic era of client patron relationships, and it might be that you're done a favour in that you're assisted to gain an appointment in the army, but you're then obligated to do your patron a favour in return that might be to support them politically or something of that sort. So To come back to the original point, you've gained your initial commission by whatever means it might be. You can ultimately rise by dead man's shoes if the vacancies open up. So a death vacancy, typically the paid for commission is forfeit, and if let's say a lieutenant has been killed, then the senior ensign should step up and become a lieutenant without need for purchase. Obviously, what that does mean is that you can progress very slowly through the ranks. Having gained, let's say in that example, you've become the junior lieutenant in your battalion. You've got to wait for the wheels to grind and vacancies to be filled, and of course, if in peacetime those vacancies could just easily be filled by somebody selling and buying a commission rather than waiting for somebody to fall in combat. So peacetime progression without money is going to be very slow, and certainly the examples would suggest that we're not just talking about buying your way to the top swiftly. That there is an ability to make your way through the ranks by ability and progression. You're never going to rise that high, but you can probably make a viable career of it and maybe retire as a major or something if you're lucky.
So is there an inherent checks and balances in that purchase system to ensure that, just like you said, breeding doesn't outdo brains?
I think money talks to a greater extent, but I mean, no colonel is going to want an absolute dud in their regiment. Now, they might put up with an absolute dud if, let's say, his father's an influential member of parliament or a peer or something, and having one captain that can't really be trusted to do much beyond turn up for duty is perhaps a necessary price to pay for somebody's patronage, but I suppose it depends to some extent, doesn't it? I've looked at later correspondence of regimental colonels looking at officer selection, and there's certainly a strong element of discreet vetting behind the scenes. Is Ensign X qualified to purchase a lieutenancy in the regiment? Is such and such gentleman of a suitable background to become an ensign or a cornet?
So it's less formal.
I think
less systematized.
It's the wonderful British old boys network, which I think is still around to some extent, and yes, it can protect you, but equally, if you're a known bad quantity, then you discreetly blackballed is probably not entirely an unfair suspicion. And of course, people who utterly block their copybooks will still be courts-martialed and cashiered if they've done something to warrant it. It isn't a job for life in that respect.
And that's in reference to just being totally taken out of service.
To be cashiered, yes. To be stripped of your commission. I mean, I guess the famous one from our era is Sackville after Minden, who's accused of cowardice in command of the British cavalry at that battle, and is declared unfit to serve the king in any military capacity thereafter. Doesn't stop him becoming a government minister later in life, as with a new name and helping you guys win your independence by messing up our war effort. But
that's right. Can't complain. So, just looking briefly, kind of broadly outside of Britain in the European armies in America. I guess I would say that similar cases to some degree. Prussia, purchase is less important. The term of service is maybe the most important thing. Frederick, I think, says that nothing can prevent the long-serving officer from his due promotion. Not someone with a lot of money. Not someone who's Mistress is very influential at court. Like, we want the officers that have seniority to be present, and that's not any guarantee of effectiveness, but it is maybe a little bit different than sort of purchasing your way to the top. I'll also say that Frederick is relatively famous for maybe ignoring this advice and himself jumping officers in rank, and probably the most famous example of this is Friedrich Wilhelm von Seydlitz, who's a cavalry officer in the Prussian army, who's a relatively junior officer at the start of the 7 Years' War, but is basically like, to, I guess, use a Napoleonic concept, like bumped up to like corps command or army command in pretty short order. I mean, he's a wing commander and eventually an independent commander of some small armies in the 7 Years' War, and he starts off the war as like a major or lieutenant colonel. So there is a quick path to promotion if the king thinks that you're effective. Places like Russia, certainly seniority matters, and social influence matters, but also personal connections. I mean, there's no better way to getting to the top in Russia than to being one of the Empress's favorites. This is a kind of classic. You see Prince Potemkin and other figures sort of rising to military prominence as a result of their close connections with the court. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're ineffective military leaders. I mean, a lot of these Russian leaders are, I guess, both very amorous with the Empress and also quite fearsome on the battlefield. So I think maybe again, the modern concept is, especially among Americans, these European noblemen, like they don't really know how to fight. They don't have professional military education like we do today. How good could they possibly be? Honor and masculinity in the 18th century, especially among the officer class, does involve, kind of trying to be effective, or not effective, but to be personal bravery on the battlefield is quite important. I mean, this is why, Granby or Sackville is court-martialed, right? It's cowardice. It's not necessarily that he's, ineffective at training or something like this. His performance on the battlefield is viewed as the most important indicator. I mean, there are Prussian officers that Frederick will cashier and throw in prison for doing things that he doesn't agree with. This might sound to an American ear like this is tyranny, and maybe you're not wrong, but it's also a way of trying to ensure that officers are leading by example, that they're sort of being personally brave on the battlefield, that they're making decisions that maybe the king would agree with. I mean, of course, the famous quote and I'm not incredibly knowledgeable in the world of boats, so hopefully we'll have some guests on to talk about naval history. But of course, the famous quote is from Voltaire on the death of Andrew, help me, the name's flowing out of my
Admiral
head.
Byng.
Yeah, exactly, Admiral John Byng. You shoot one admiral to encourage the others, and I mean this is in Britain in by the 18th century standards a relatively democratic society. I mean you're in a constitutional monarchy more or less, right? And they're shooting admirals, so throwing an officer in prison, by contrast, in the Prussian case, maybe it's not quite so tyrannical. In America, again, maybe moving in a more modern and democratic direction, you have junior officer grades in some regiments that are elected. The men select their own officers. They vote for their officers. There are, other ways for advancement in the Continental Army, depending on which historiographical school you agree with or which group of historians you agree with. The Continental Army is some new revolutionary thing, or it essentially looks more like these other European militaries. But in reality, it's probably both in some ways, right? There are long-standing power structures in the Continental Army alongside new traditions like men electing their own officers. And it's also worth saying, again, shout out to my mascot, Baron von, or he would like said, judging on his correspondence, Baron die Steuben. He's a European officer who, through networks of patronage and connection, Ben Franklin in this case, finds himself traveling over to North America to fight in the Continental Army. So, again, a bit of the old, bit of the new. Is it a revolution? Is it sort of transitioning towards something new? These are what these historians are often fighting about in the realm of officers in the Continental Army.
On a selfish note, I know there's the private soldier, there's the officer, but there is an in-between in there. Can we speak a little bit to that non-commissioned officer, that NCO,
The
corporal
NCO.
sergeant?
Yeah, the backbone of the military.
Backbone. Some might say the backbone. Yeah.
Yeah. I was at a conference in DC in 2022 called C-List, but like senior enlisted, basically was the goal, and they wanted me to speak about Steuben and like how America came up with the backbone of the military early on. I mean, non-commissioned officer ranks in some ways go back to the Middle Ages, right? I mean, like the sergeant is initially a man on horseback with like a kite shield, right? He's not a modern NCO, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, but through most 18th century armies, kind of coming out of the military traditions of Louis XIV and earlier, you have kind of almost like this soldierly middle class between the enlisted men and the officers. These men are promoted from the enlisted ranks. Usually they're literate men. I mean, you have to be able to do some paperwork as a senior NCO. These men are, Andrew talked a bit about officers self-selecting. You don't want a dud to rise to the top in your regiment as someone who has a moneyed stake in your regiment. Likewise, you want to try and find competent enlisted men to promote into the ranks of the non-commissioned officers so that the regiment will be well run, the paperwork will be completed. These men will be seniors. And I know there's a tradition in the modern U.S. military, and I'm sure other militaries around the world, where you have relatively junior commissioned officers coming into military units, like a second lieutenant, and he's hypothetically in charge of the unit, but the senior NCOs for the first few months, maybe the first year, will kind of be like, okay, this is how things are done, this is what we're doing, but do you really want to make that decision, sir? This is very much the case in the 18th century as well, at least in my experience. Looking at the Prussian army, you have an officer on the battlefield at, I want to say it's either Prague or Kolin, it might be Kolin, in 1757. The unit's just been overrun by cavalry. Like, the men are lying on the ground because the cavalry just essentially passed over them. And the officer's getting ready to stand back up and dust himself up. And one of the NCOs is like, "No, idiot, get back on the ground. Another wave of cavalry's coming." And so the senior enlisted men frequently are a little older than the junior officers. And so as a result, they kind of bring maybe a depth of experience that junior officers might not necessarily have. Especially in kind of dangerous battlefield situations.
I do really enjoy. I'm sure you've seen them, the cartoons of the officer who is drawn as a child who's trying to wear the bearskin. I think is one of a grenadier. The bearskin's like falling over his face, and the sergeant is laughing at him to that, illustrating that point exactly, which is a wonderful parallel, kind of crossing time periods, which is great.
I think as well you do at least towards the end of the period begin to get an ability where there are even certain, if I say professional commissioned roles, and I'm thinking things like adjutants and quartermasters here, where even a well thought of, shall we say, regimental sergeant major equivalent can even make that jump. They're never going to become an officer and a gentleman in the sense that we think of, but that professional mobility does begin to increase. Thinking certainly towards more the 70s, 80s than perhaps was the case earlier. You get a few extreme examples of men being commissioned and even ennobled from the ranks, but they're very much unusual. I'm thinking there was a private dragoon knighted after Dettingen for capturing a French standard, but George II did rather get carried away knighting people after Dettingen, and he won his little victory, and he wanted to make the most of it.
It was a big moment for him.
It was.
Yeah.
I'm Alex, you can put me right on this. I'm vaguely thinking of Frederick plucking somebody out the ranks, and I can't quite recall the story.
Yeah. So there are, as far as whether it's true or not, I think that's something I'd have to run down, because there are much like Napoleon or other more modern figures. There are a lot of like books that come out in the 1780s and 90s as Frederick is older and getting ready to die. It's like anecdotes of the king, And so, whether or not this is, being made up to sell books or is a real thing, Frederick elevates a man, I think, in the War of Austrian Succession from a senior sergeant to a commissioned rank. And the reason why I'm not sure it's quite correct is because then the guy deserts. And so it's like, oh, can you really, trust the enlisted men? If you raise them to officer rank, they'll just run off. And so this is a very, in my mind, almost like 18th century morality play kind of tale, which makes it fit well in this collection of anecdotes that are very much like this. But yeah, raising men from the ranks is something that it is possible. Sometimes you'll see men in the officer biographies that are so common. A lot of publishers in the 1760s, 1770s, 1780s are writing short biographies of Prussian generals, and so you'll see in their early history joined as a private. But it's really more of like a gentleman volunteer, right? And then from there, he goes on and has a more distinguished career in the realm of his kind of family traditions. With that said, in the Prussian army in the 18th century, you do see a lot of non-noble men in getting elevated to officer ranks. Maybe they were not enlisted, but in the course of the 7 Years' War, Frederick's fairly desperate to have a lot of officers getting killed. This is very much lead from the front, environment and time, and a lot of officers are, perishing on the battlefield, and so as a result, by the end of the 7 Years' War, you've got a lot of non-noble men in the army, and that was tolerable for Frederick during the war. But when the war's done, he says, let's try and put these guys back in the artillery. Let's maybe put them in some of the garrison regiments, which are like the low grade, forces in the 18th century that are just basically maintaining fortresses. So, is it an egalitarian world? Probably not. I mean, there are examples of enlisted men that become officers. Nothing quite on the level of like Sharp, a la Bernard Cornwell. But with that said, it's something that is often born of necessity, not necessarily because Frederick is like an egalitarian figure who is like a true a believer in true meritocracy or something like this.
That's a great place, and and of course this topic, we could go on forever with all the different aspects. But I think we should move into our murmurs in the camp. Because there's so many topics, where can people find more detail? So what books are out there? What resources do you think are valuable for somebody who wants to really dive into a lot of what we've talked about today? What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, so I'd recommend a couple. First, if you've not yet read Military Experience in the Age of Reason by Christopher Duffy, it's still the best place to start on this period. It's a survey of the armies, their social history, their tactics. It's a great sort of one-stop way to update your knowledge on the 18th century military world. With that said, I'll also kind of just throw in a second, specifically in the world of common soldiers, which is what I write on in my academic work. There's kind of been a revolution, and so people like Sasha Mubius and Ilya Berkovich have really kind of tried to change our understanding of these common men, what motivated them, what was their background, like what was their experience of battle. And so Ilya Berkovich is Motivation in War. Sasha and his wife Katrine together have written a book, I think called Prussian Army Soldiers in the 7 Years' War, The Psychology of Honor. These are both great resources if you're interested in what kind of the internal worlds of ordinary enlisted men in the 18th century.
Well, I'll jump back to my my endorsement of Maurice de Saxe and recommend a biography for anybody who wants to know more about him. I mean, I'd be the first to say it's not the best book on his battles. There are better accounts, but for a biography and for what he was doing in his youth, so in a very adventurous youth at that. The book's called Marshal of France, and I've had to take it off the bookshelf to remind me, but it's John Manship White. It's not a new book. My copy is second hand, but if you can find it and you want to know more about the Saxons' exploits, military and otherwise, then that's the one for you. Perhaps the other one I'd throw in as well. Sort of a voice from the ranks of the British Army, the memoirs of Corporal Todd, who served through was briefly a volunteer against the Jacobites, but never got near an angry Scotsman, and then served through the 7 Years' War in the 30th, I think it was at the 12th Regiments of Foot, and I think that's where there are more increasingly as I get into this period. There are far more rank and file accounts than we might assume, but I mean, Todd's has been published and very well annotated, and is probably one of the most accessible ones to look for, and that was published by the Army Records Society. So that's a second recommendation.
Awesome. And you, Lee?
So there's a book, Fit for Service. It's specifically about the British Army, and it is a wonderful book with an enormous amount of information. You got to take it in doses, though. It's a lot of tables, a lot of numbers, really great stuff. But the other thing I would like to say that I just kind of thought of is one thing that I think is really valuable is finding the local site around where you live, because then you can start thinking, learning about what regiments, what units, or what, in some cases, what people are doing operations in those areas. And you start to, as you learn more, you can kind of, in some cases, see them kind of show up on the map in other places. And that kind of helps you have a personal connection, and that can help you understand, again, the guys that we're talking about, but also the organizations they're part of, which is something that I love a good book, but getting out in the world is another wonderful thing. Yeah,
if you live in the UK, go to your regimental museums. They're a treasure, a national treasure.
We've gone into a lot of detail about a lot of this stuff, and there is much, much more. So maybe we'll revisit some of these topics in the future for a little bit deeper of a dive. But for right now, I think that's a pretty decent primer on the 18th century military. And again, we'll dive into more details as the opportunities permit. That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed the show as much as we did. Don't forget to subscribe or follow so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend and leave us a review. It really helps, and we'd really like to hear your thoughts. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. It's produced by Lee Gugino. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.